the GEEK Files, 2025, December 28th. Burnaby, BC. So we got a contract to fly a bunch of stuff from Whitehorse into the silver mine Plata. So we flew down from Inuvik to Whitehorse and picked the stuff up. Plata was an extremely rich silver mine. The galena just sat on the surface. So basically they had loaders and bulldozers just picking the stuff up and then shipping it out. This is the mine where, for someone who's had such an amazing influence on my aviation career, I really can't remember the owner of VYZ. But this is the mine where VYZ was traded for shares in the mine. The owner of VYZ, we'll talk about him in the future. He was is a real piece of work. So it was wrapped up in legal proceedings because he wanted his aircraft back and blah, 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 blah. And it was a pretty easy contract, but this time I had my feet under me. We're running really well. The aircraft is performing well. I'm at least staying current with daily maintenance on the aircraft and nibbling away at the other stuff on it. So it's basically in and out, fly this stuff in a 1-day contract, I think, in and out. And then, it's Whitehorse. We knew a whole bunch of people, so we partied. The next day we loaded up and we're going to Fort Mac. No, we're going to Watson Lake. Nope, Fort Mac. Now, one of Greg's responsibilities was calculating fuel loads and fueling the aircraft. So we fueled up in the morning, and I think there was some confusion over whether we're going to Fort Mac or Watson Lake. Yeah, and Greg fueled for Watson Lake and not Fort Mac. And after takeoff, this was discovered when Dean started pointing the aircraft to Fort Mac and not Watson Lake. And there was I was in the jump. I didn't have a headset, so I'm listening to these. I can see a very animated discussion going on, and all of a sudden we turn back. Oh, Greg was flying. And Greg had pointed the aircraft at Watson Lake and not Fort Mac. Anyway, we're coming in, and there's cumulonimbus over the airport, and we're getting bounced around pretty good. And Greg, phenomenal pilot. He had this thing, had the boo just dialed. Now then, about pilots, they don't really like to admit mistakes, and they really don't like returning to an airport when they do make a mistake. One of the best examples of this is a couple of the Pacific Western pilots flying 737 Whitehorse to Edmonton. They had a layover. The afternoon flight had a layover in Whitehorse. Well, in the morning, they took off and discovered that each pilot had thought the other pilot pulled the gear pins, and they didn't. And so the landing gear was pinned, their safety pins, so that you put the safety pins in so that if something happens to the hydraulics or it's being towed around, the landing gear doesn't collapse and the aircraft wind up on its belly. Because it was a layover, the 737 had its gear pins in overnight, And for whatever reason, they didn't pull the pins. So instead of coming back to Whitehorse, landing, getting out and pulling the gear pins, they flew all the way from Whitehorse to Edmonton with the gear down at a reduced altitude. Now, this was the 80s and you could get away with stuff like that. They got caught. Now, with the landing gear out, you can imagine that they're using more fuel than required. And the way they got caught was an accountant looked at this and they had to take a lot more fuel than normal. And that had actually put them, which would have been just a company issue until it was discovered they landed below minimum fuel load. And then, all hell broke loose and the DOT had an investigation and both pilots were lost their licenses. And then the co-pilot got his back because it's always the captain's fault. No matter what happens to the aircraft, it is always the captain's fault, whether he's responsible or whether he had any influence on it or not. So here we are returning. Now, Dean is pissed off because we're returning because Greg short fueled the aircraft for Fort Mac. But we're under this thundercell and we are coming in and it's beautiful. Greg has got this thing dialed. It's on rails. And this pisses Dean off. So 10 feet above the runway when we're landing, Dean dumps the flaps and drops the aircraft 10 feet. As a mechanic, basically I assume, it's my aircraft. Pilots are borrowing my aircraft. So Dean just dropped my aircraft 10 feet onto the runway for no reason. Then he's pissed off at Greg. When we got out of the aircraft, Dean, when I got done with Dean, he didn't know whether his butt was ream bored, rat chewed, or punched. Yeah, I was an unhappy camper.